Assalamu alaikum, everybody. In today's episode of Mind Over Mike, let's talk about the Makkah Agreement, our middle powers building a new security order. For decades, the security architecture of the Middle East it rested on a familiar assumption that the United States would ultimately provide the security umbrella. But what happens when regional states begin to conclude that they can no longer outsource their security? The Makkah Agreement, bringing together Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and Türkiye, may be important not simply because it is another defense pact. It may represent something much larger. The emergence of a security architecture increasingly designed by middle powers themselves. And that raises a much bigger question. Are we witnessing another alliance or the early architecture of a different regional order? The three countries bring very different forms of power. Saudi Arabia brings economic resources, political influence, and strategic geography. Turkey brings one of the region's most capable militaries, an expanding defense industrial base, and decades of NATO experience. And Pakistan brings a large professional military, extensive defense relationships, and uniquely among the three, nuclear weapons. But the significance of the arrangement is not simply the sum of their military capabilities. It is the principle behind it. Regional states assuming greater responsibilities for regional security. That could be stabilizing. Greater regional ownership could strengthen deterrence, distribute security burdens, and reduce dependence on external powers. But it could also be destabilizing in some eyes. If the agreement evolves into an exclusive bloc, it creates new threat perceptions, intensifies arms competition, or becomes identified with sectarian or geopolitical rivalries. It could reproduce the very insecurity that it is trying to resolve. So this is where the Western response becomes important. For Washington and its allies, greater regional burden sharing is not necessarily bad news. The United States has spent years asking partners to assume greater responsibility for their own defense. But there is a paradox. What happens when those partners actually begin constructing security arrangements over which Washington has less control? And that is the real geopolitical significance of the Makkah Agreement. It does not necessarily signal the end of the American-led order, nor does it mean the emergence of a Muslim NATO. It may instead point towards something more interesting, a layered security order, one in which the American alliances remain important, but they coexist with regional coalitions, strategic partnerships, and middle power networks. And for this architecture to survive, military capability will not be enough. It will require institutionalization, interoperability, clearly defined commitments, political consultation, mechanisms for crisis management, and above all, clarity about whom and what the agreement is designed to deter. Because collective defense agreements become dangerous when their commitments are stronger than their political consensus. So the real question raised by the Makkah Agreement is not whether it will replace the Western security architecture. It is, are middle powers beginning to build an additional layer of international order themselves? And if they are, the future may not be a world without the United States. It may be a world in which Washington is no longer the sole architect of security. And of course, then there is India. New Delhi is watching this arrangement carefully because the Makkah Agreement potentially connects two security theaters India has traditionally tried to manage separately, South Asia and the Middle East. For India, the concern is not necessarily that Saudi Arabia or Turkey would automatically enter a future India-Pakistan conflict. The more consequential question is whether Pakistan now gains greater strategic depth, defense industrial cooperation, intelligence support, and political backing from two influential middle powers. That could alter India's calculations during a future crisis with Pakistan, even if the agreement's collective defense clause is never actually invoked. But India also has deep economic and strategic relationships with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. So New Delhi's challenge will be to prevent this emerging architecture from hardening into an India versus bloc dynamic. And that gives us another test of whether the Makkah Agreement is stabilizing. Does it deter conflict or create new linkages through which a bilateral crisis can become a wider regional one? And that remains to be seen.